Our next speaker, Bill, is a top global influencer and opinion leader on privacy, security, and cyber incident management. When he was global communications leader for IBM financial services sector, Bill dealt with many fintech outages and incidents. As a top privacy campaigner, Bill is now not only ranked as the #1 global social influencer for privacy by both Analytica and QDOBuzz, but is also highly ranked for related issues, second globally for government technology and top 50 for things like cloud and smarter cities. As a commentator, Bill has more broadcast airtime than any other technologist in the UK. Please join me for his keynote on why traditional crisis management techniques don't work with cyber incidents. Enjoy.
Hi, welcome to the Virtual PR Summit. My name is Bill Moo, and I'm the founder and chief executive of the Crisis Team. I'm going to be talking to you about crisis communications and the looming cyber threat, and explaining why the greatest threat of all requires a totally different approach. We're facing a massive challenge here. I mean, how do you deal with the only crime where the victim gets the blame? The only area where failure regularly to test and evaluate your processes could result in massive fines, and the only area where on average a problem is discovered something like 200 days after it has occurred. All of this is the cyber risk that we threat, and it's the greatest threat out there at this moment in time. Most importantly though, it requires a totally different approach. Let me just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Bill Moo. I'm a digital ethics advocate. I focus on doing the right thing and changing the world and a whole lot of other fun besides. This is striking the right balance, I believe, between meaningful protection, which is exceedingly important, and the maximisation of economic and social value. And I focus on areas like privacy and security on one side and value creation and innovation on the other. I'm also the founder and CEO of the Crisis Team. We're an elite team of experts in incident response, cyber law, reputation management and social influence, and we help clients minimise the impact of cyber incidents. Much of my focus as an ethics advocate is in four main areas. First of all, there's the freedom to innovate and maximise overall economic and social value. And I've been a champion for various different UK players. I'm also one of the judges on the UK Cloud Awards, and I write extensively about the use of cloud and GovTech and other areas of innovation such as smart cities. I also focus, of course, on meaningful data protection for citizens, and I've helped crowdfund an NGO called None of Your Business, which was the organisation that brought the major cases on day one of GDPR against the technology giants. I think it's important that we have accountability and enforcement of data abuse, and I appear regularly on broadcast television talking about some of the abuses and the incidents that have occurred, and focusing on things like facial recognition, digital ethics and other privacy and security issues. But of course, on the other side of the coin, there are companies that are the victims of cybercrime. And when this occurs, I am there to help organisations protect them from misinformation and the sort of hysteria that you see when companies are the victims of this sort of cybercrime. And I've spoken out on behalf of many organisations, including, interestingly enough, Huawei recently on the 5G issues in the UK, and I can come on to talk a bit more about that. I'm profiled as one of the leading privacy and digital ethics advocates in the world on social media, and also highly rated for other topics from cloud to GovTech to smarter cities, etc. And I appear very regularly on television, on broadcast TV and radio, possibly about as much as once a week over the last few years, more broadcast airtime than any other technologist in the UK. I'm going to start by focusing on a few myths. The first of all, I'm going to look at the fact that many organisations aren't particularly worried about cybercrime because they believe it'll never happen to them. they shouldn't be so sure. The fact that you may believe that you're not going to be targeted because you're too small, too unknown, too unimportant, or whatever, isn't any form of reassurance or safeguard whatsoever. You need to be doubly aware that the risks at this moment in time are somewhat heightened because of the amount of remote working. We've never been so interconnected or so vulnerable as we are at this moment in time. And the cyber criminals that we're facing out there are opportunists. They're going to go after organizations of all kinds and of all sizes. And it's probably a matter not of if you're going to be targeted, but when. And given the fact that breaches can take more than 6 months to detect, it may already have happened. Obviously, in this era of the lockdown, there have been any number of useful articles and checklists about how we can react to home working, how we can do this securely. And there are many different areas that we could focus on here. I hope that you're all taking significant precautions and that you're making sure that you and all your staff are showing the very necessarily high levels of cyber hygiene in order to ensure that you are as secure as possible. I think, however, that the big lesson to learn here is not about home working. That's purely a factor of the sort of digital transformation that many organizations are looking at anyway. The real lesson here has to be about awareness of risk and crisis preparedness. We have a situation where we've had a number of massive disruption events, each of them caused by risks that we possibly could have seen but probably hadn't been sufficiently appreciative of. We had the credit risk in 2008 where there were risk managers in banks who were seeking to raise the alarm and they were ignored. There's the health pandemic at the moment in 2020. And again, there were people who sought to raise the alarm and they were ignored. And obviously you have the cyber risk, which is possibly the largest looming threat out there. And there are a number of CISOs out there who are seeking to raise the alarm at this very moment in time. And again, they're also being ignored. The reason by some of the whistleblowers or the people focused on these risks are often ignored is that almost all members of the management team of organizations are focused on ROI factors, return on investment. These are things like revenue and profit. And this is the way that they're incentivized and this is the way that they actually behave. This was very much the case during the financial crisis in 2008, when all of the different organizations ignored the credit risk. And as a consequence, they chose not to listen to the risk managers that were seeking to raise the alarm at the time. And the consequences were calamitous. Again, we're seeing the calamitous consequences of failing to appreciate the health risks in regard to the pandemic. And we could well face the same again with the cyber arena in the future. The only person currently who is ROR focused or looking at return on risk and the risk appetite of an organization in respect to cybercrime is the CISO or the Chief Information Security Officer within an organization. Very often these CISOs don't have a seat on the board and don't have a particularly strong voice. They can do their very best. And even where they do have a seat on the board, they're not always listened to because they are alone in having an ROR focused when the whole of the rest of the management team are focused on ROI. And it is this mismatch which continually makes us vulnerable to various different massive risk events. We're seeing, however, that crisis preparedness is becoming rapidly seen as a source of competitive advantage, and it's a real opportunity out there. We don't want to make the same mistakes necessarily that we did in the financial crisis or the pandemic, and we want to be ready for whatever the next major crisis is, be that a cyber crisis or whatever. And indeed, those organizations that have a strength in crisis preparedness see massive disruption events of this kind as a unique opportunity to capture the market. It's very difficult to disrupt the market yourselves or to leapfrog the established players in any particular segment. This only very rarely happens, and it tends to be around times of massive disruption. And this is going to occur again with the pandemic, just as it did with the financial crisis before, where we saw some very major names, some big brand leaders in the market either fail or lose their position dramatically. And we're yet to see the results of what's going to be happening to organizations as a consequence of the pandemic. But you can be sure that those organizations that were crisis prepared are going to come out of it far more strongly and are going to actually capture large amounts of market share from organizations that are reeling at this moment in time because they simply weren't crisis prepared. And in terms of the risks out there, cyber is seen as possibly the main risk, and PwC's Global Crisis Survey every year looks at this very metric, and cyber is seen by people across all industries as the greatest threat that they see in the future. Another big myth that I'm going to seek to address is the fact that we've got cyber insurance and therefore we're covered. We're fine. Well, I wouldn't be so sure. Cyber insurance isn't always all it's cracked up to be. Cyber insurance policies often include a host of provisions and exclusions that make it almost impossible to claim for any type of incident. And we've seen a number of recent incidents with the health pandemic where business continuity policies have failed to pay out and companies have been left reeling as a consequence. But also we've seen a number of incidents with cyber insurance with the non-petya and the WannaCry claims and other claims in between, where insurers have either refused to pay out on certain provisions, but also they've either not paid out at all, or they've only paid a very fraction of the costs. And we'll come on to mention a couple of these. The real attraction of cyber insurance is that you believe that you're going to have yourselves covered for any kind of cyber incident, and also the fact that it's cheap and it's easy and it's quick. But these aren't necessarily good attributes. The reason that it's cheap is because the cyber insurers don't necessarily know how to price the risk that accurately. Even Warren Buffett, who is one of the leading figures in the insurance industry, has come out to say that he thinks that he and almost all of the others in the industry really don't know what they're doing when writing cyber risk. In terms of how easy it is, well, you have to worry a little bit about the detailed risk analysis that insurers are doing before they insure you. Many of them are using cyber security risk ratings. These are a bit like the credit ratings that you get from Equifax as individuals. They will tell you how creditworthy you are, just in the same way the cyber security ratings will tell you how cyber secure an organization is. But these are terribly crude methods. The way that they do this in many instances is that they'll employ a web crawler to go out and look at any externally facing endpoints that belong to your company and look for known vulnerabilities out there. If you do a number of different patches, you'll have a very low score one day and a very high score the next, which very little has actually changed internally. It has been described as somewhat similar to taking a photograph from the opposite side of the street and using this to assess fire risk. You can tell what a building's made of, it's brick and it's large and it's reasonably well maintained, but you don't know what is going on inside. You don't know if it's got sprinkler systems, you don't know if it's got flammable materials. You know very little, and it's a very crude way of assessing risk. And finally, it's quick. Cyber insurance companies boast that they can give you a quote in under an hour in many instances. You've got to question why the rush and what level of cover you think you're getting at that speed. And the reason that cyber insurers can afford to insure you in this way is that they include a whole host of typical policy provisions and exclusions in their contracts, and you need to be aware of these. There are some of the examples that I give are the fact that they focus on policies that only cover incidents that are just involving you. If the hacker targets you alone. Obviously, this isn't the way that cybercrime works. Cyber criminals are opportunists, and they'll go for a whole lot of schools one week, and then they'll focus on local government organisations the next week and whatever. It's very much a scattergun approach. The provisions and exclusions also include the cloud, and they exclude anything in cloud infrastructure that isn't owned or by yourself in terms of the hardware and software. And anyone who knows anything about public cloud knows that this just never is the case. It may be for limited use of private cloud, but elsewhere you never own the equipment. You're also not insured for any third parties that are unduly restricted or have any limited financial liability. Well, it's the case that actually every single contract you sign with another party is likely to limit liability in some way. Unlimited liability contracts simply don't exist in this day and age, and that would exclude almost all third parties. You're also excluded if there's any out-of-date software. I mean, you could have a single instance of Windows 7, say, in some corner of some office somewhere on your technology estate. Now, it may not be the attack vector. It may not be a PC that you use very often at all. But if they discover that you're working and operating a single instance of an out-of-date piece of software like Windows 7, then that could exclude the entire policy, even though it wasn't the attack vector for any particular attack. There's also the insider threat, so anyone that is part of your organization that causes an incident, that obviously leads to another exclusion. Internet service providers aren't covered because they have to be under your operational control, and I don't know how many of your internet service providers out there that run your website and any of your externally facing systems are actually under your operational control. I'd be surprised if any of them were. Then there are acts of war, and given the fact that most viruses and cybercrime is led from countries like Iran and North Korea and Eastern Europe, it's very common for any type of attack of this kind to be deemed an act of war, as was the case with the NotPetya attack, which many insurance companies chose not to pay out on because of this very clause. And then there's the fact around pre-existing conditions and compliance. If you've actually listed any particular concerns or weaknesses as you drew up a business case to implement cyber insurance, or if you've been through any sort of compliance audits in the past which have identified areas that you need to focus on in the future, then these are deemed pre-existing conditions. And because you knew about them before you took out the insurance, they are totally excluded, and therefore they are grounds for, again, not paying out on your insurance. But then you need to think about, well, it's not just whether you're covered, it's what they're actually going to cover you for. Now, imagine if you've been crossing the road and you're the victim of a hit and run and you're knocked down in some way. What sort of cover would you expect your health insurer to provide? Do you think they'd stretcher you to the side of the road to make sure that you are safe from any further impact and deem that as having done their duty and do enough? Or would you expect them to provide an ambulance to get you to hospital, or maybe a doctor to check you out when you got there? Are you going to expect actually some surgeons, some of the best surgeons available, to be engaged to actually help fix you and to make you right again? There are very different levels of payout here, and we saw with Norsk Hydro, which was a Norwegian hydroelectric company that was hit by ransomware not long ago, its total costs mounted to over 70 million euros, but the payout that it got from its cyber insurers was something like 3.6 euros, about 6% of the overall amount. So you need to be exceedingly concerned here about what policy you have and what is covered. I would advise that you speak to a specialist broker. There are some really good ones out there. They will find a policy that is right for you and your risk appetite. They will also be able to ensure that some level of adequate incident response is included. And if they don't promise to give you the freedom to bring in the incident response specialists that you want, then you need to demand that, because there's a very big difference between if you have a heart operation, having the best heart surgeon available to do it, and a normal GP or a family doctor. So you need to ensure that your policy is either going to provide you with the very best incident response expertise, or you need to take out a separate policy for incident response. The next myth I'm going to focus on is we can fix it ourselves. This is fairly standard stuff. We've got a team that can deal with anything. Well, that's not necessarily going to be the case. What we find is that tech teams often attempt a DIY fix. They will do their very best to try and get on top of a situation. And the time when typically the experts are called in will be most commonly a Friday afternoon. This is the point at which the internal team have done everything they can, and they finally admit to their superiors that they just aren't up to the job and they can't solve the problem. And they then call in the team that's really going to fix stuff. And that team should have been there right from the outset, because all the time wasted will have led to further exposure and possibly complicated matters a great deal. You also need to be aware that a lot of the textbook approaches aren't going to work in a cyber incident, and that a totally different approach is required for a cyber incident. And you need to have the really specialist support to navigate you through these really very complex incidents. We recommend a four-stepped approach. Obviously, first of all, you need the technical fix. Then you need a legal fix on top of that to make sure that you're protected from any kind of regulatory or litigation action that's going to occur. And then you need the brand defense that's going to defend your brand and your reputation, before finally focusing on the social response, which is going to deal with some of the hysteria and misinformation that we typically see in this kind of incident. Look at the first step here. It is enormously important that you call in the experts right away rather than seeking a DIY fix. The speed at which these things are fixed fast and accurately is often the factor that has the greatest impact in limiting exposure, and therefore getting an expert team in fast at fixing the situation, and also providing you with really accurate digital forensics that is going to give you a true picture of what the problem was and what the entire scope of the problem was, is actually going to then put you in a position where when the legal team come in, they're going to be able to focus on developing a legally defensible narrative from the technical forensics that they've been provided. Now, you need to have the best legal guys on the job. It's the heart surgeon scenario here. You need to be able to reassure your board that you are navigating the regulatory hurdles adequately, and that you're going to minimize any exposure to the sort of regulatory action or litigation that we commonly see. And typically your in-house legal team, or whichever retained law firm you have, at some point are going to seek the opinion of expert counsel in order to have some form of assurance on this particular aspect. What we do is we provide direct access to the top Queen's Counsel in Europe for cyber law in order to cut out the middlemen and actually speed this up for you. Then we look at the brand defense, and one of the things that you need to be aware of is that a cyber incident is very different from any other kind of incident. If you picture a bank, it needs to open its doors to allow its customers in to withdraw money, but occasionally some guys are going to turn up with guns and they're going to try and withdraw more money than they're allowed. When this kind of thing occurs, it's very, very obvious to the press, the public, to everyone, that the guys with the guns are the bad guys. They're the villains here. And the victims are the bank and its customers. This is a scenario that we see in almost all types of crisis management incidents. In this type of incident, it's important for the bank to get on top of the issue. First of all, they will attempt containment. If something isn't public, there's no need to shout about it. But obviously, if people have walked into your bank with guns and a lot of people have been scared, then it's very difficult to hush that up. So you then move on to the next phase, which is where you put forward executives to say that you're taking the situation very seriously, and that your executives then show a level of empathy for the customers in order to gain sympathy from the press and the public. This formula works almost every time. By showing this kind of empathy, showing that we're taking this seriously, we're caring for our customers, we're making sure they're all okay, we're making sure they're all compensated, you actually make sure that you remain seen as the victim here along with your customers. Things are very different when we start to talk about a bank. It could be the same bank when it gets hacked. In a cyber incident, you don't know who the hackers are necessarily. You possibly don't even know when they were hacking, because the incident may have occurred some time beforehand. In this sort of scenario, research has shown that it is almost always the bank that is blamed. And therefore, you just need to accept that as much as you may dislike it, you are going to be held as the villain in this scenario, even though you've been the victim of a cybercrime. It is very unusual in being almost the only crime of any kind where the victim of the crime is typically seen as the villain in the scenario. Therefore, you need to understand that you need to adopt a different approach. If you were to take the standard textbook approach, which typically involves some form of containment followed by a level of showing empathy in order to gain sympathy, and this is the sort of approach that has been set out in almost every single crisis management textbook and almost every single public relations textbook, then this is a recipe for disaster, because you are going to be seen the villain here. And by putting your executives forward, it doesn't matter what sort of empathy they seek to show, they're going to be shot down in flames. You're just putting them in the firing line. You need a very different approach here, and you need experts who are going to take you through every single step and show you the best tactical approach here. What you're going to need is some support in a number of different areas. You're going to need extra resources to help you deal with the added complexity and the enhanced communications workload. Expert resource that is specialist in this particular field. The expertise that they're going to need is going to be focused on understanding cyber issues and the best tactic to use with each different type of cyber incident, be it ransomware, leaks, outages, breaches, whatever. And you also need people who are going to have all of the right contacts. You need strong existing relationships with the top influencers, regulators, press, analysts and activists right across the data privacy and cybersecurity spectrum. In order to do this, you're going to have to be focused not only on preparation, and there is a mandate under GDPR for you to test and assess your systems, or you're simply not GDPR compliant. So it's possibly the only type of crisis management where there is a mandatory obligation to test in advance. So we would suggest a level of scenario planning and also immersive simulation exercises that are going to keep your team on their toes, and that you can show the regulator that you carried out as a means of preparation to show that you were serious about this. You also need to be really well primed for incident response, ready to move quickly to get the experts in to provide the expert heart surgery and expertise that you're going to need at this moment in time. Right from the incident response time for the technical fix to cyber law, reputation management and social influence. It's important that you focus on having this level of social support at a really professional level. This is all because cyber incidents are different. They cannot be treated as a normal crisis management scenario. You're likely to be on the back foot because typically these incidents are underway long before your own internal staff are aware of them, and typically you will be notified about something when it's already happened by some sort of external third party, and it may date back some distance because breaches are typically discovered something like 200 or more days after they've occurred. And you've just got to accept that however unfair you may feel it is, you're going to get the blame. And traditional tactics like containment aren't going to work. You have a mandatory disclosure obligation under GDPR of 72 hours. And on top of that, simply trying the old trick of showing empathy to gain sympathy isn't going to work, as I've already explained. So you need to have a very different approach in a cyber incident. Also, you're going to face a level of hysteria and misinformation, which are typical in these sort of scenarios, and these are very difficult to combat. We're working in an era where there's an enormous amount of fake news, cynicism, and mistrust. And actually, there's a very short number of places where you can go to find trusted voices out there. At a time when you've been hit by a cyber incident, your credibility is going to be at an all-time low, and it's going to be very difficult for you as a corporate organization or any of your leading executives to combat the hysteria and misinformation that is likely to occur. Your employees on a wider basis can be a really useful resource here. Typically between them, they will have a far wider collective number of trusted relationships on LinkedIn than the company will have itself. Actually using your employees as trusted sources, using the trusted relationships that they already have to get the message across at an important time like this, making sure that they have the right messaging to share, making sure that they have a system internally for employee advocacy already set up to enable them to do this, will pay dividends enormously. On top of that, obviously, the press and the analysts are typically going to be some of the most trusted voices out there. Hopefully you will have some pre-existing relationships with certain press and analysts, but you may not be the kind of organization that typically has really strong relationships with the security analysts or the privacy analysts or some of the really specialist press in this particular arena, and therefore you may need assistance in this regard. And finally, the trusted voices that I think possibly have the greatest potential here are influencers. And these are people who have enormous recognition on a global basis. Now, influencer marketing is well understood, and it can be used for good news in order to deliver messages with real expertise and credibility in the good times. But it's little understood that also influencer marketing can be used in the bad times as well, when your credibility is an all-time low, and you can use trusted voices to counter misinformation with authority and to counter hysteria with a great reach and credibility. And sometimes employing these tactics can pay a real dividend.